Happy Tuesday, everyone. My name is Sierra Ladroma. I have recently joined the team as project manager for the Iowa Center's Women's Business Center. Now, the Iowa Center's Women's Business Center is funded in part through a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Small Business Administration. It's incredible to be able to bring inspiring entrepreneurs, workshops, and events to the community. Many of you would have received a form to complete. Please do so after this event. This information allows us to continue providing free educational programming for small business owners in Iowa. I'll also put that form in the chat option for you to easily get to. Feel free to use the chat option or the Q&A to add questions or comments. Today's presenters are Samantha Wagner and Nora Walsh. Samantha is a staff attorney at Iowa Legal Aid, where she provides legal services and representation to low-income entrepreneurs. Samantha has extensive experience with creating creative solutions to clients' legal issues. Nora Walsh is an associate advisor at SVN Create. Nora's family background in commercial real estate gives her the enthusiasm she has for the field today. Nora brings a strategic yet personable approach to the commercial buying and selling process. Please join me in welcoming our speakers, Samantha and Nora.
Hi, everybody. So thanks so much for having us. We're just thrilled to be here. This presentation was actually born a year ago when I gave a presentation about commercial leases, and Nora happened to be in attendance and had so many incredible insights that I thought, gosh, the next time we do this, we really need to have her share all her gems and her expertise. So we are thrilled to be presenting together. So just some brief introductions. I'm Samantha. I'm an attorney at Legal Aid. Nora, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Nora Walsh. I'm happy to tag along this time around. I'm an associate advisor at SVN Create. We're a commercial real estate agency, so we represent owners and occupiers of all commercial real estate, tenants, sellers, buyers, but today we're going to be going over the tenantscape.
All right. And how long have you been doing that?
I have started off on the property management side about 5 years ago and started in brokerage about 2.5.
Okay, great. So just a few housekeeping things. Oh, if my slides will advance. So our services are free. We provide free legal services to low-income entrepreneurs and nonprofit organizations. We help everything from folks beginning a business or I'm just thinking about starting a business to it didn't go well and I need to shut it down. We do transactional work, business and tax advice, comprehensive guidance, as well as litigation. A lot of the litigation, well, I would say almost exclusively, the litigation that I do in this job is tied to commercial lease disputes. So I have seen what happens when these things don't go well. And it is my goal to help you be in a place where that never happens. Hopefully you will take away some gems from today's presentation and completely understand what you're getting into before you sign a commercial lease. Know the things that you should try to negotiate and push back against, and not be surprised by any sort of traps for the unwary. If you have a commercial lease with no terms for termination, and the landlord is not willing to discuss termination of the lease, what would you suggest? The individual sign the lease just for the COVID-19 crisis, and as a result of the pandemic, it's not practical to start the business. Well, we will get into some of that later on in the presentation, and we'll also try to designate a time for questions too. Again, just a few housekeeping things. So Nora is a part of SVN Create, and I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how people can get in touch with you or what kinds of things they might come to you for, Nora.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I always recommend with the tenant process, you should be looking, if you already have a business plan written up and you're ready to go, I still advise that you start looking at these at usually 9 months is a little bit more ideal. It kind of depends on your use, but really there's a lot of things that can come up. I suggest you go for it as early as possible. If the SBA is a great resource if you haven't written up a business plan yet, and you can go a little bit further in detail there. If you're looking to reach out and you just have some general questions, you're not sure when you should start searching, what you should be looking for, you can feel free. My phone number and email are on there, and I'll usually get you a response in the same day. In terms of tenant representation, usually you really have the upper hand. I would say about 95% of the time, you don't have to pay for the services. The landlord will cover that. So there's a huge perk there. I would definitely love to assist you. But I always say that this process, it's kind of like a job interview. You should interview each other, always feel comfortable with who you're working with, no matter what field. So I'd love to have a discussion with you and see what kind of requirements you're looking for and be able to go through this a little bit further for you.
So Nora, I have a question. So if someone is considering working with a real estate agent and or broker, and they, feel like they need some help finding a location, and they're kind of trying to do that matchmaking or interviewing process, what are the types of questions they should be asking you or someone in your position?
Sure. One of the big to look for is see if the real estate agent is asking you about the different requirements. Are they going in depth in business plan? Are they asking who your ideal tenant or your ideal client or customer is? How many questions are they asking you? If they're not paying much attention to what your specific needs are, giving you advice right off the bat, I would say that is the biggest thing to mention. It's kind of like an interview where you really want to question each other. So if they're not attentive enough to be asking you specific questions about your business, if you're already in order location, have they a good idea for that? That's probably one of the biggest indicators, I would say. Being able to tell if an agent is going to be attentive to you or not. Through these slides, you'll kind of see all the main things that you should be worried about, and those are the sorts of questions that you can ask them. But if you're wondering if the agent's a good fit for you, personality is important, but also just make sure that they're being attentive to your needs. They're responding to you right away. You should never, it doesn't matter if it's your first or your seventh location, they should definitely be attentive to your needs and responding in an appropriate time.
Great, thank you. As far as working with an attorney is concerned, I always tell people that it is my job to make sure that you understand, and I'm sure Nora would agree with this too, but if there's something that you don't understand, please ask me to clarify. Please ask me to re-explain something or to put it in a different term, because at the end of the day, it's only helpful to work with an attorney or with a real estate agent if you understand what they're saying and are getting your questions answered. So at least for my clients, I never am annoyed when they ask me to explain something again or to go over something in more detail. So
definitely no such thing as a dumb question, especially in this circumstance. It's a big deal. So if you think a question's dumb, it doesn't matter. We won't judge you in our professional atmosphere. We deal with that all the time. So if there's ever something that we're used to using that terminology and you don't know what it stands for, please always ask questions. There's no such thing as a dumb question.
I was presenting with another real estate broker earlier this spring, and he always says it should be a red flag for you if you ask someone, hey, what is this term? Or I don't really understand this. And they say, oh, don't worry about that. Yeah, that would be a red flag for me too. So don't be afraid to advocate for yourself as you're thinking about working with an attorney or a real estate broker. So generally speaking, here is how you can apply for our services. The easiest way is probably to contact me and set up a time to do an intake. It's easiest to reach me at my email here. I don't know what the easiest way to contact you is, Nora, maybe email?
Yeah, email is great, but both those phone numbers, they're linked to me, so I always have both phones on me at all times. But email, I'll always get back to you within the same day as well.
So just as a heads up, I know that a lot of folks in your businesses are experiencing coronavirus-related concerns. The Iowa Legal Aid website is constantly being updated. We have a specific page dedicated to coronavirus or COVID-19 questions. So check that out. And we also, another thing that you guys should know about is the COVID-19 legal advice hotline. So even if you would not qualify for Iowa Legal Aid services, everyone can call into this hotline. And for folks who don't qualify for legal aid, volunteers through the Iowa State Bar Association and the Polk County Bar Association Volunteer Lawyer Project are volunteering their time to answer COVID-related legal questions on this during this time. So feel free to go ahead and give that number a call. Today we are going to be discussing general legal information helpful for business owners to keep in mind. I cannot discuss specific situations, and nothing I say should be considered legal advice for your situation. In order to do so, you would have to become my client. So I definitely encourage you to apply for our services if you think you might be eligible, or even if you might be close. And I always tell people that the specific facts often can change the answer, and there can often be more than one right answer. So it's really hard to get into specific questions on these types of presentations. So here's the thing: if you take away nothing from today, let it be this. If you follow basic business contract 101 principles, you will be in good shape when you're working on getting a commercial lease agreement signed. Don't leave your sound business, principles at the door just because you fell in love with a location or you just want to be done, right? Entrepreneurs are so smart and so clever and scrappy, and I want you to apply that same business acumen that you have in running your business to signing an agreement, right? So basic stuff here. Get it in writing. Make sure that the final writing reflects your final agreement. Cautionary tales, right? Oh yeah, we'll fix this, but no, yeah, sure. The lease doesn't say that. We'll fix that when you move in. Well, guess how easy it's going to be to enforce that if you didn't get it in writing, right? It just is going to make sure that everybody is on the same page. Nora, go ahead.
Yeah, it sounds simple enough, and you think you're going to do it, but I definitely can't stress that enough. It sounds logical, and of course I'll do that, but it is, I would say, way more than 50% of the time, probably at least 70% of the time, when we'll be doing a general kind of negotiation where nothing then the final lease contract, some of those terms aren't matching up. They're missing things that we could have discussed on the phone multiple times. Maybe we had in writing elsewhere on a non-legally binding contract. You always want to make sure that you have that lined up to reference back to, because it happens way more often than not. You can expect when you send it over to your attorney, there's going to be lots of adjustments and red lines. Definitely don't be afraid to negotiate back, because that is obviously beyond important to do, and you think it's something that you'll think of right away, but you want to make sure that you have everything listed out. Any emails, discussions you guys have had, you really want to ensure that has made it into that final contract, because there are so many times where they've forgotten it or intentionally omitted it, and it's really important to make sure that you double check those documents. And that's why I always advise that you have a legal advisor as well, because they're catch those things. They're used to looking at it every day. So can't stress that enough.
My boss always says that good fences make for good neighbors. And I think that that's so true. I think the benefit of contracts is to make sure that everybody has expectations that are on the same page, right? Oh, I thought you said we would have, a 60-day free, no rent owed period. Oh, no, I said 6 days, or, something like that. So it really helps make sure that everybody's on the same page. And frankly, if you're getting some attitude because you're requesting things be put in writing, that should probably tip you off that maybe this business relationship isn't one that we want to pursue any further, if they're not willing to finalize your final agreement into writing.
Yeah, and just like you want to have a legal advisor, an accountant, and a realtor, and everyone that works when you're interviewing each other, It's the exact same thing with a landlord. COVID is one of those really big things where people realize how important it is to have a good standing relationship with your landlord. They need to believe in you and really be working with you. And when it comes to shopping around, I definitely encourage everyone to do that. You can write multiple non-binding offers with several locations at a time. And a lot of times that can give you extra leverage. If you're negotiating down the road with another landlord and they're at about the same rent rate, but someone's giving you, a much longer rent abatement period, they're not going to be jacking up your renewal rent. They have a lot better options for you. You can tell that to the other landlord. And a lot of times it gives you more leverage and it can really benefit you.
And I think this sort of reflects how beneficial it is to work with a real estate agent, somebody who knows these things, right? Someone who kind of knows the lay of the land. A few other points: make sure you read this thing before you sign it, and don't sign it if you don't understand it, especially if it's not in your native or first, language. Things might mean something different than what you think they mean. So it never hurts to have a second set of eyes on it. And tying back to sort of the first point, beware the template, beware the boilerplate language, right? So a lot of times clients will come to me and say, hey, my landlord gave me this contract, or the person I was supposed to enter a contract with said, this is the same contract they use for everybody. Well, a lot of the times there's going to be terms that are really specific to your situation. Maybe you've negotiated for a rent abatement period, for example, or they're going to contribute to some of the build out or some of, getting the premises ready for you to move in. Well, if they're using the same contract they use with everyone, it probably doesn't include that. So you should be very, very cautious when using, a standard agreement, and make sure that it's tailored to fit your needs. And lastly, make sure you're shopping around and negotiating. Take a look at, similar premises in the area. A comparable premises in a different part of town. Just in a lot of these things, someone like Nora is going to be clutch in helping you figure out.
And also that business plan, making sure that you can write a checklist out of all your needs. A real estate agent is going to be able to bring about things that you might not think of off the top of your head, but make sure you at least have a bit of minimum requirement. I've already researched, this is the type of clientele I'm trying to get. So, maybe you want to be nearby schools or, certain demographics. Those are some things that you really don't want to ignore. You can get taken aback by, you see one gorgeous new construction building and that's all you can think of. You really need to refer back to what are the needs, because a lot of times you can, find second generation space and cater it to fit your needs, and you're ending up saving so much money on rent. You're saving so much money on the construction. You really want to analyze all of your options and try not to get blown away by the pretty facade or the newest thing, because there's adjustments that you can make, and you definitely want to. I always write up an Excel sheet and I do a side-by-side comparison for my clients and always say, this is everything that you're looking at. And sometimes they forget all the important aspects that they're able to get at this other location until you really put it side by side. So, yep, I absolutely encourage shopping around. I wouldn't close on anything too early.
And that fits in so perfectly with our next slide, which is, you really do need to think, what do you need in a location? You need to shop around and compare. The first place you see that beautiful new construction might be ridiculously high for the neighborhood you're in. And it also it really depends on what kind of business you have and what needs you have, right? Take time to think about it and take time to do your own research. Talk to other tenants. Observe the premises at different hours and figure out why the previous renter left, for example. I always tell people about the sort of Ben and Jerry's rule, which is anytime they open up a new location, they'll, of course, research. They know they need a lot of foot traffic, so they'll go at different times of day or on the weekend and sit and literally take a counter and count how many people walk by to determine if that's a good fit for them. So maybe you toured the facility on a Saturday when there was a lot of traffic, foot traffic around, and people were there and shopping. But Tuesday morning and Tuesday afternoon are completely dead. So, you know, I can't emphasize enough to figure out what it is that you need and make sure that that location has it. I've also had clients get completely taken of, it really had some problems with parking, right? Like there was not enough parking and there wasn't designated parking for their business. So they had to shut down because customers couldn't get in the store. I know Nora wanted to touch on parking a little bit too. Nora, did you want to talk a little bit about parking?
That's a lot more common than you would actually
concerns?
expect. If you're going to have a use that's like a physical, yeah, can you hear me all right? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, sorry, lost connection a little bit there, but parking is people have this issue a lot more often than you would think. If you're going to have a use like a physical therapist or a chiropractor, anything where people could have any injuries, that's a given. You need the handicap parking spaces. You need designated spaces just for your location with the sign out front. But also it kind of ties into other tenants as well. I think that's great advice. I always suggest that people be checking it out at all times during the day to see when they're getting the most traffic, not only if you're needing the foot traffic or the drive-by traffic, but also checking out things like the parking. You know, I've had let's say there's a yoga studio and a tea shop, but the yoga studio only has the designated times that people will come in. And let's say there's about 40 people that come in for each class and there's only 45 parking stalls. Now that tea shop, although it would seem like a great benefit to have them next to each other, they have no parking left. So no one's able to get to that. And I have had very similar situations happen way more frequently, and there's really not much you can do about it if you haven't written that in the lease. Give yourself some designated parking spaces, but also do some homework, you know, and just like Sam mentioned, go there before. When are your peak hours and when are their peak hours? You're going to want to make sure that coincides. If you have a bar and you have a coffee shop, that's probably going to work out pretty well because a majority of the parking stalls are going to be taken from the bar at nighttime, and a majority of the parking stalls during the early morning and afternoon are going to be taken by that coffee shop. But you still want to make sure to do your homework, check it out, and make sure that works for your uses and get that in writing. If there's any designated spots that you can get, you definitely want to push for that.
A few other things to think about are things like bathrooms, bathroom access, is it shared? You know, what do bathrooms look like? Is it somewhere you'd feel comfortable, like lactation rooms or waiting areas? Those can all be really important parts of a business. I also think about folks like caterers or bakeries where you need somewhere, some sort of designated spot where people can pull up and, you know, load really quickly, a good loading area that's available. So it really is, this is going to involve some soul searching and thinking about what you and your specific business need. So before we go much further, there's lots of questions about, okay, what types of commercial leases are out there? And I think that, you know, it's my opinion that it doesn't really, the sort of specific classification doesn't really matter so long as you understand what's in your lease. Mm-hmm. Just remember that, because even though you've done business with someone before, that does not mean it is the same the second time you sign that lease. As with all types of leases, you should always exercise precaution. So generally speaking, there's a couple different types. Gross leases, you pay rent, the landlord pays everything else. Net leases, also known as flow-through leases. We'll kind of dive into that in our next slide here. And then there's any sort of like combination of gross and net leases where the landlord's paying for things and you're paying for other things. These classifications don't matter so long as you understand what you're getting into. So I tried to think of some sort of way to remember what a net lease is, and I think maybe the more nets you have, the more expenses that fall through the net and go to you. I don't know, it's kind of a tortured metaphor here, but all this to say, depending on what is in your lease, you may have to pay more than you expected, right? So for a single net lease, you pay the rent and the property tax. Landlord pays everything else. Double net, you pay rent, property taxes, and insurance. And a triple net lease, which I think is probably the most common, is you pay rent, property taxes, insurance, and operating expenses for structural maintenance and repairs and common area maintenance. And what all would be included in that and how it's calculated really depends on the lease. You can get into some pretty complicated square footage calculations and dividing that among all the tenants, or it can be sort of a standard thing. But these are all things that my clients have unfortunately been surprised by. Nora, did you want to add in some color on that?
I like the net analogy. That's clever. That's a good way to think about it and help you remember that. But as Sam mentioned, you just want to make sure that they really have it detailed out for you, because different landlords can use different terms and sometimes, just kind of interchange them. You want to make sure that you really just have it detailed. I would second that triple net leases are the most common that we deal with. So, that should be the next question after you say, okay, what's the rent price? You need to consider what all the other, the property taxes are. They can be completely different with new construction, depending on where you're located. If you're in Waukee versus downtown Des Moines, everything is going to be completely different. So you want to make sure that you ask for that. And you also want to see if it's going to be increasing, because if it is a brand new construction property, it's likely that they'll be increasing. So you want to get that from the landlord. They should always have those estimates available for you. And it's pretty important also to know how it is being divided up. If let's say your utilities are based on square footage, you might think that sounds like a good idea, but if you're opening up a boutique and you're surrounded by a restaurant and a coffee shop and a bar, all these places that are going to be using tons and tons of water, and you're just paying for a fraction of that when the only water you utilize is in the restroom as your boutique, that's going to be pretty important and can end up making you pay a lot more in utilities than you would have otherwise. So asking if things are separately metered is going to be another important question to ask as well.
And as Nora said, you really are going to want to get an estimate for these sorts of things and figure out what that's going to look like for you, because I think it's so easy to get fixated on just the rent amount, because that's what we're used to paying in our personal lives, or the rent and the mortgage or whatever. But there is a lot more that comes with it. So hopefully after attending this presentation, you will not be surprised. If you know me, you know I love very crude Photoshop. So very low budget Photoshop here. So hopefully by understanding all of the true costs associated with your lease, you'll be better able to make business decisions that make it more likely that you'll have a resilient business. It's always better to go into something fully aware of the consequences and possibilities that you might face rather than being surprised. Here are some things that my clients have been surprised by. Snow removal fees, trash removal fees, additional fees to put up a sign, additional fees to take down a sign outside on the marquee, HVAC replacement or repair cost. A lot of these leases will say, yeah, we've provided the HVAC, but if it stops working, it's on you. And that has been an expensive lesson for some of my clients to learn. Nora, did you have anything else to?
Those are all very common. They're in pretty much every lease there. So again, like she mentioned, the snow removal, those common area maintenance, it goes beyond being in a multi-tenant building. It's more than just a shared lobby. It's also going to be included in the landscaping. If there's any repairs that are needed for the parking lot, roof repairs, there's all these additional costs. So you really just like I said, there's never a dumb question. There's also never too many questions. Make sure you have them outline absolutely anything that you are responsible for versus what they are responsible for, and make sure that you're able to make that a fair agreement. Your legal advisor should be able to tell you, as well as any agent, that what's common, but you really want to just make sure that upfront you're aware of all costs, because that can be the biggest business killer, is not being aware of it going into it.
And, that's something to think about with all the other tenants who are in the building. And are you going to have to pay a disproportionate share? Is it based on square footage? How is that expense shared and divided? These are all really great questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to operating expenses or common area maintenance, just a few tips here. So try to exclude capital improvements, right? Making sure that they don't get to charge you for, changes or additions they're making to the building or equipment that will benefit the landlord in the long run. You may also want to try to negotiate caps or a maximum amount that you could be charged for this expense. Usually you're given a projection and it's reconciled at the end of the year. And you should also ask for audit rights, so you get to see, okay, let me see all those bills from the snow removal. I had a client who was very skeptical that her snow removal bill should have been so high, and that would have been a really useful thing for her to have. Some of the common area maintenance fees generally include the cost for cleaning, protecting, lighting, repairing, replacing, heating and air conditioning the building, as well as sort of the common facilities that are shared. And another thing to keep in mind is the age of the building. With technology, that you may have different requirements, right? Things may break more often. So that's always something that I tell people to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And to kind of touch on that, additionally, I would say check with the landlord and see when the last time they've had any repairs done, any full replacements. Things like HVAC can be very pricey. You can do a cap. So anything over $1,000 that requires a repair that the landlord must cover or replace altogether, you can require that they have all filters changed out before you move in to make sure that you're in the best position possible. But those are all completely reasonable things to ask for.
So what types of things should you try to negotiate before you sign? We'll get into these in more detail, but generally, permitted uses, the term, the rental amount, renewal options, and common areas. The obvious answer is that you should try to negotiate anything you don't like and want to change. But these are the things that we kind of think are particularly up for negotiation. And remember, you never have as much leverage to negotiate as you do when you're still shopping around. Once you sign, you lose that power. So use that power from the very beginning to try to get the best possible deal, because it's, once you sign, it's that the ball game's kind of over. I see we have some chats here, so I was just going to say, can or should you have an inspection done of the property like you would when you buy a home? That's an interesting question. Nora, have you ever had anybody do an inspection of the premises?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little bit more common when they're having it actually purchased. They'll have an appraisal and just make sure that everything's in good working condition. But yeah, absolutely. If you're especially a contractor, usually they'll be able to help out. If you're gonna be reconstructing the space anyway, usually I would have a contractor come along with you, because they'll be able to point out, oh, you want to have, let's say it's a massage therapist and they want sinks in each of the rooms. Usually they'll be able to point out things that maybe you wouldn't think of because construction's not your eye. So I would always have someone come along with it to be able to point out anything you might not know. Now, if you were to have an actual inspector come along, typically you would have to just expect that that's going to be on your dime. That's the only kind of precautionary measure, but that's a great thing to do. Then there's typically you want to work out in the lease agreement that if there was any just undisclosed latent defects or something, that you wouldn't be liable for it. But to protect yourself from the get-go, I think that's a great idea. Like I mentioned, I see it a little bit more often in purchase and sale agreements than I do in the leases, but it's definitely great, at least to bring along, I would say, contractor, if you can get an inspector just to do a general search. Usually there's different levels to it for the price, and you can have a kind of general inspection to see if there's any leaks or there's an issue with the roof or something like that. So that was a great question.
Yeah. So let's see here. Oh, all right. So the first thing to try to negotiate is the permitted use. The question you should ask about this is, am I prohibited from doing something that competes with a neighbor? On the flip side, do they have the same restriction? I recently had a client who was disgruntled to learn that her neighbors didn't have the same rules that she had to follow when the landlord leased to another business like hers. If you have to follow something or a certain restriction, then you should try to get, language for the other tenants to have to do so too.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can imagine there's any sorts of little wrinkles on this, right? If maybe I'm not allowed to open a coffee shop, but am I allowed to serve some sort of iced coffee drink or like an ice cream latte dessert type thing? There's any sorts of, questions about these sorts of things that come up, and you want to make sure that your uses that you see or maybe could see in the future are going to be included. I actually had a client who she had to follow one of these restricted use clauses, and her neighbors didn't, and they actually were able to open up a competing business right next to hers and siphon off some of her clients. So this is certainly something that that you should look into. The other thing to consider is whether, are you allowed to do this according to the way that the area is zoned? You'd hate to get all of this done and signed and ready to go, and only to find out that you're prohibited from doing that due to zoning. But the bigger thing is, your business may change over time, and you want to make sure that your lease contemplates that.
Yeah, and I would say, sometimes you would think that a landlord would know all that and be able to inform you of it, but you really want to do your research on your own in terms of the zoning. There could be something, if you're wanting a coffee shop and now you see that with COVID-19 how important it is to have a drive-through, that's 100% you need a location with a drive-through, and then you find out it's actually not zoned for it. Sometimes you can talk with the city and see if you can get a zoning change, but if you're in a it's best to do that research beforehand and make sure that all of your uses are really permitted under that. In terms of with the complex, like Sam mentioned, the competitive uses, it's called an exclusive. If you're having a coffee shop and you want to think about this on your own end as well, you're going to ask him, hey, is there any of my uses? What are all the exclusives at this location? Because maybe there's a free chef hours down. Opening a coffee shop, you think at some point you want to have as an ancillary use, you might want to some pastries. Is having any pastries an exclusive use? Are you allowed to have any? And you also want to think about it at your own end. So if you're a salon owner and you provide waxing services, and then you have Wax in the City open up right next door to you as well.
Other sorts of things to think about is if you're a chiropractor or a spa type business, is that competing with something like that? Or if you have a pharmacy and there's a big box store as a tenant in the area that has a pharmacy, is that competing use? You really want to get some clarity on that before you find yourself in a sticky situation. So the standard length of many businesses don't make it after 3 years, let alone 5. I always encourage people to consider negotiating for a higher price but a shorter length to give you better options. Terms matter in establishing obligations and deadlines. So, remember to keep that in mind as far as figuring out, maybe you don't have to pay rent for the first 3 months, but technically the lease started then. So that's going to impact when you have renewal deadlines or something like that. I also love the idea of building in an exit, the option to renew or to exit. Hey, we tried this for a couple of years, it didn't work. Rather than be on the hook for another, 5 years or something like that, let's negotiate so that I can have an exit if I need to. So that can be impacted by both length and defined terms. Nora, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, you definitely want to keep yourself protected. You know, it can be scary to think that far in advance. Oh, I don't know if I'm going to want to renew or anything. Give yourself enough time. A lot of the terminology will say within 6 months of your lease end, you'll have the option to renew, or if you're going to finish your lease, you can complete it that way. A lot of times you can really negotiate with the length. I would agree that 5 years is the average. Sometimes you can get it down to 3. That's a little bit more if you're retail. It kind of depends on the use and the specific landlord. But if they right off the bat, you know, start trying to negotiate with 10 or 12 years or something like that, don't ever lock yourself into something like that. That's what the renewal options are for. So you want to make sure that you have a reasonable start and then give yourself the option to renew. You know, maybe you have longer renewal terms, because after you're up in operation for 3 to 5 years, you should have a pretty good gauge of, yeah, I think we can survive another 5 years. I think 7 years, absolutely. So you want to give yourself those options ahead of time so that you can have an exit strategy. But
I know that Nora has some like crazy victory stories of getting people down from 10 years to 5 years, because she's just such a good negotiator business lady. So
and those can go back to the advice that I already gave. I've had some where they stated, nope, we're only doing a 10-year lease, absolutely not. And we backed out, said, okay, well, we're negotiating elsewhere. They're allowing a 5-year or 7-year lease, so we're going to head in that direction. Then they start backpedaling. They might say that they're standing firm, and that's the power of negotiation. That's the power of shopping around, realizing, hey, that's not what everyone else is offering. It's really sad to say this, but a lot of times they'll be able to recognize, okay, you're not being represented. You're completely new. You haven't had any bricks and mortar before. Sometimes landlords can recognize that and will try to set you up for that. So if you're fully backed up and you're letting them know, nope, actually I was negotiating elsewhere and I'm able to have a shorter term lease, that'll really give you an advantage.
So a lot of people, think that, we think about rent in the same way we think about rent for maybe a residential space, but sometimes these leases contemplate rent a little bit differently. Sometimes there's a fixed rent amount for the whole 5 years. Sometimes there's an annual increase. Sometimes it includes a percentage of your gross income. If so, you're going to want to figure out how that's defined and what counts. Sometimes landlords might be flexible with the base rent in order to allow you to, try out a new idea. Hey, we're trying this new thing that's popular in Europe. It's inexperienced here, but we're really going to try it. And the landlord's coming on board by being really flexible with you. In exchange, they might, take a part of your proceeds instead and kind of come along with you in your business journey. It's really common to share a part of your income for restaurants and retail stores, and you may be able to negotiate in things like chargebacks if the business slows down, if it's, something for a busy month or an average at the end of the year. The landlord usually tries to give themselves audit rights too. So that's definitely something you should be familiar with. Nora, did you have any thoughts on that stuff?
I think you covered it pretty well. I think that also just stresses the importance of having a good relationship with a landlord, is being able to have those adjustments, especially if you're having a new or unique use. If you're, dealing with CBD or a new kind of dog bar concept, anything like that, you're going to want to have a good relationship with them. And like she mentioned earlier, with a lease, it may be a standard lease, but you can really research and get some unique aspects to make it work for the best for both of you.
So we talked a lot about this already, but you really want to try to build in those options to renew or expand. It would be so sad if you really had a thriving business location and only to find out for whatever reason for the future. So things to think about are the timing, any deadlines that you have to request that extension. I've seen some as far back as 6 months, 90 days, something like that. What the terms are, what the rent will be. Maybe you want to stay at the same place, but you want a little bit bigger, place within the same premises. Maybe that could be an option for you. But the other thing to think about here is if the landlord expands, What's going to happen if the construction negatively impacts your store? So you should have something built in that says, you know, if it happens, you're going to provide signs and parking and, you know, different things to let people know that, yes, we are still open if you are doing construction. So those are just some things that I think about. I don't know, Nora, if you had any other.
Yeah, well, construction, that is a big one. That can cause a huge mess. I'm sure all of you know, you're driving around, if you know that there's extreme construction happening on a particular road, you're typically going to avoid it. You're going to want to avoid that. So you want to make sure that you're being fairly compensated for that, because otherwise the landlord's the only one reaping the benefits. You're still having to pay your portion of the rent, but you're not benefiting. You could be losing. So you want to make sure you watch out for that. Within the complex, this is a fairly common one, not only the option to relocate within the premises, but I typically suggest people ask for the first right of refusal. So if you're either your adjacent neighbors, if this is a multi-tenant building and you have a neighbor and he retires, it's the perfect opportunity. That gives you the first option. They'll say, hey, you know, he's retiring, going to be relocating, something like that. Do you want to take on that additional square footage? So I always recommend people ask for that. It's just a right you have. It doesn't mean if they leave that you're required to have it. It just means that you're the first person that they go to, and that's a huge one.
So we talked about some of these common area considerations already, but you know, a few things to think about. How much are you paying versus how much do you use it? If you've got a catering location and you're paying for some pretty expensive common restroom facilities, maybe that's not totally worth it for you if it's just you who's kind of at the premises. Is it something that's going to get more expensive as time goes on? Who's liable if someone gets hurt on the loading dock, for example? Does it actually become part of your premises? How will you enforce your ability to use it? Do your homework. Make sure that you have those parking spaces, for example. And then how do you calculate the area? A few other things to look out for. Continuous operation provisions. So a lot of leases will have something that says you need to be open almost every day or weekend, or it's considered a violation of your lease term. I had a client who had a funeral home business. And so obviously with a funeral home business, you are not really necessarily there all the time. You're really only there when there's you know, work to be done. And she kind of ran into a situation where the landlord accused her of abandoning the premises. So make sure that any sort of continuous operation provision is adjusted to reflect your business and its schedule. Many commercial leases have subrogation clauses where they provide that the party that suffers a loss from the other party agrees to waive its rights to recover from you and rely only on their insurance. So if that's something that's in your lease, you definitely need to make sure you have that insurance. I've also seen leases that state, hey, you agree that you have insurance. And so I'll ask my clients, hey, your lease says that. Do you have this insurance? Well, no, I didn't know that. Well, you know, that's definitely something that you don't want to be caught by surprise. So a few other things, you know, vacancies and permitted uses. That kind of goes back to the exclusive use we talked about earlier. Who controls what can go into a vacant space? Exculpatory clauses. It protects the landlord from being liable for damages, and it's usually enforceable. So try to get that removed. At the very least, you should try to carve out, you know, hey, the landlord's still going to be responsible for gross misconduct or their defaults or something like that. Did you have any thoughts on those, Nora?
Not any specifics, but I would definitely just say, you know, you want to make sure that you're reading the fine lines. That's what you have your legal for. But there's going to be so many things where they might just try to brush it off and say, oh, well, you're not really going to have to deal with that very often. That's not too relevant. If it's in the lease, it's going to be relevant. And, you know, you always want to make yourself prepared for the worst. You know, if there's any requirements for flood insurance or, you know, anything that you don't think is that likely to happen, if it's in the lease, then that means it can happen, and you need to make sure that under any circumstances you are protected. So don't let them brush anything off, even if they've said, oh, no one's ever had to use it before. If it's in there, then it's important.
A few other things. Many of these leases provide for attorney's fees if the landlord has to try to sue you or, you know, collect on some sort of default. You might want to try to limit it to their out-of-pocket expenses and limit it to reasonable attorney's fees to give you some sort of control on that. For fixtures, what happens to fixtures installed when you move out? I'm thinking about freezers and chandeliers and refrigerators and you know, appliances and all that kind of good stuff. If you haven't taken it away already, because of something called a merger and integration clause, you want to make sure that you get everything into the written agreement. So a merger or integration clause is basically a thing that lawyers dreamed up that says, hey, everything we negotiated for is in this agreement. Everything that we talked about is in here. No other emails count, no other discussions count. This is it. This is the whole enchilada. And because of that, you want to really make sure that everything you talked about gets into that written agreement. And the last thing to think about is, you know, what sort of freedom do you want to make changes to your storefront? Generally, you're going to be required to get landlord permission. Try to negotiate a time period for the landlord to respond and a right to make, you know, sort of, you know, cosmetic or not things that aren't going to change the integrity or the, you know, the main structure of the building without landlord approval. Nora,
Right,
do you have?
That might require, especially if you're going to be working with a lot of equipment, if you're food grade or something like that, you're going to be required to make sure that you let the landlord know ahead of time what your plans are for plumbing. If there's not already a grease trap interceptor, that's required in Polk County. You need to have a grease trap interceptor. So you want to make sure that that's understood with the landlord, any costs that are associated with that, because that can be a huge price. If there's, let's say you have some equipment that goes on the ceiling and it requires a hole punch in the roof, then they need to be aware of that beforehand, and make sure that that's in writing as well, that they're aware of that, who bears the cost burden on that and how that's handled, because that does interfere with the structural integrity of the building. So those are things that's why you kind of want to have everything laid out beforehand, especially if you're dealing with equipment or extensive plumbing, any requirements like that, you're going to want to go and have a pretty good knowledge of beforehand so that you can review that with the landlords when you are checking out the locations.
So just as we shared some things to definitely look out for, here are some things you should try to include, right? Cure language. As long as you're showing an effort to cure the default, they're not going to terminate your contract. If you rely on anchor stores, consider asking for reduced rent or an option to terminate if that anchor store closes. And again, I also love building in the right to terminate. Consider building in an ability to stop early for failure to achieve performance levels. You want to spell out your exit plan and what that would look like, and that will end up saving you a lot of headache down the road. So just jumping ahead, what the defaults are going to be really are going to depend on what your lease says. That's going to be the most important thing, is what does your lease say? That said, there are some things that I definitely think you should know about. It is Iowa Legal Aid's position that commercial landlords have to follow the same due process rights that residential landlords do and provide notice and hearing to evict commercial tenants. That said, many leases provide contractual liens, giving the landlord the power to lock out people who are in default for things like non-payment of rent. It's happening, even though, you know, legal aid disagrees with it, it's still happening, and it could happen to you. Some leases I have seen even give the landlord the power to seize items in the location to recoup losses from not being paid. This became an issue in a case I had where the client really wanted to liquidate their inventory and sell everything so they could try to pay the landlord, but they couldn't because the landlord had all their stuff and had locked them out. It can become even more complicated when they seize things like personal property. I had a client who had some items belonging to a deceased child in the premises that we had to try to negotiate to try to get back for her. So, you know, you definitely don't want to be surprised by what happens when there's a default. That's just some examples of language to look at. So we kind of touched on this earlier, but who should I consult before I sign a lease? Definitely an attorney, definitely a real estate agent or a broker. But I also would consider looping in your accountant, Definitely you're going to want to talk to your insurance provider, especially if you're agreeing to provide insurance as part of the contract. If you're part of a franchise, you're going to want that franchisor to take a look, talk to other tenants at the location, any third parties who might be involved. These are all really great folks who can help advise you on this. So before we wrap up quickly, I just wanted to address some sort of COVID-19 concerns that are going on right now. And Nora, I'm going to have you jump here in here in a minute. But a lot of folks are in a tight spot right now because they can't pay their landlord. The landlord wants to get paid. We understand that. Everybody has a business to run. At the end of the day, it is my true and honest belief that it is in everyone's interest to reach an agreement. That said, you cannot force people to be reasonable. Even though it's, I think everyone has something to win by coming to an agreement. We're having a lot of conversations about what happens if my landlord won't negotiate and I can't pay. And so these are sorts of the things we talked about, the consequences of default, right? There could be accelerated rent and with lease termination, suing you for the rest of the amount that's owed on the lease. Many leases require you to sign and agree to be personally liable. So even if you have an LLC or a corporation or some sort of separate legal entity, you still could be on the hook depending on whether you agreed to be personally liable. There are always two sides to a lawsuit. Just because, there could be some defenses that you have in place. And the best thing to do is to talk to an attorney to kind of get a sense of what those defenses might be. And for these reasons, I really do think it's important to reach an agreement. And kind of hear some bargaining tips that I think you have. If you're interested in learning more about this stuff, since we're just kind of sailing through it pretty quickly, I actually did a webinar with Bill Wright, and in my webinar, I think, is on the Iowa Center's webinars that are available to stream on demand. So it would be really helpful to kind of hear more of those things in depth. We have a chance to kind of dive in more about that. But I wanted to know, Nora, from your perspective, what are some of the creative things you're hearing from your tenant about, how they're getting through this situation? Are they having any creative solutions that they're able to work out with their landlord?
Most of them are, yes, just because people, just like Sam was saying, it's in both parties' interest to benefit from this. So, it's going to be all the legal costs that you would have to go through. Some of the specific pandemic terminology wasn't always used in the lease agreement. So there's been a lot of disputes as to, well, does this constitute? Is this force majeure? What is this? Does it really count? And no one wants to go through a legal battle that could take, months or years, and it's going to cost so much money. So that's why I think it's so good to have a good relationship with your landlord. I have heard of people saying, okay, I cannot get this month's rent to you, but we've already been here for 2 years and we've proved ourselves. Can we tack this on to the end of the lease? Or put interest on it. There's a lot of creative solutions that you can come up with for a pandemic or anything else. Now to put that in your lease. But if there's not one that's already in place and you're already in your lease, to work it out with your landlord. It's going to be in both of your interests. They want to get paid. It's not going to benefit them to kick you out and have no one to replace you. It's going to cost them money if they're going to put a new tenant in there. So they're going to want to reach a resolution as much as you are. But those are probably the most common ones I've heard, is tacking it on at the end, adding some interest to it, some other form of benefit that is going to also help out the landlord and show that you guys are loyal to each other.
Absolutely. I've heard of a lot of people really trying to work together. So I think a question came in about where the other presentation is. I think it's available on the education page, the other webinars that are out there. Again, it really is in everybody's best interest to try to reach an agreement here. Here's, circling back to the main points of this webinar. Do commit any agreement you make to a signed writing. Do not rely on good faith or the memory of the parties. I can barely remember what I ate for lunch last week, let alone the terms of some sort of agreement that we came to about our commercial lease, right? Again, good fences make for good neighbors. whether it's, you know, a little agreement you're signing in light of COVID-19, or whether it's something that you're signing from the get-go, get it in writing. Do consider things like due date and the ability to prepay if you have a really good month or something like that. Do state that you're not waiving any rights or remedies you'd otherwise have under the lease, and do put in a provision allowing an agreement to be signed in separate parts and signed electronically. You know, we're all social distancing now, right? We're just so grateful for your attention and for your time. I know you have lots of other things you could be doing. Again, if you think that if you have a question about this, these are my favorite types of cases to work on. And this is an area where I think we can really do a lot of good for people. So don't hesitate to reach out if you think you may qualify for our services.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're really appreciate you guys having us present. It's been a joy, and look forward to talking with anyone. But if anyone has any questions that we haven't already covered, be happy to answer.
Yeah, and I can't say enough good things about working with Nora. If you're ever in a situation, I would definitely encourage you to get in touch with her, see if she can help you out and help you negotiate.
Right back at Samantha. I think she is a great resource there. And honestly, even if there's any other resources that you guys are looking for, you know, an insurance provider or anything like that, if you already have someone that you work with, if it's your legal advisor, your real estate agent, anyone that you already really respect their opinion and you can tell that they're pretty experienced, you know, ask for their referrals as well, and they'll be your best bet there.
So we had a question came in that said, I have some great space and I want to sublease it at a loss to myself to move it quickly. So does the new company coming in have an agreement with me and the leasing company? So again, I can't answer specific situations, but generally speaking, when someone is a subtenant, that sublease agreement refers back to both the leasing agreement and the like, I guess you, for the person who would be subleasing it. So it would be sort of, you'd be the landlord and the tenant at the same time. So yes, generally speaking, the agreement would be with both. And if you would probably need to check your lease, because most of the time those leases require landlord approval before you can do anything. So